Karl Marx is often remembered as a name attached to arguments, revolutions, governments, and warnings. But before he became a figure that people defended, feared, quoted, misquoted, and fought over, he was a restless young man from a provincial city on the edge of old empires. His life passed through philosophy classrooms, censored newspapers, police files, unpaid bills, crowded exile rooms, and long days inside the British Museum, where he tried to understand why the modern world seemed to create so much wealth and so much misery at the same time. This is the story of Karl Marx, not as a statue, slogan, or shadow over later history, but as a man living inside the 19th century, trying to name the forces that were changing it. The road begins in Trier, where law, family, religion, and empire shaped the first world he knew. Chapter 1. Trier, Law, and the Making of a Restless Mind. Trier stood in the western edge of Prussia, with more past behind it than most towns of its size could comfortably carry. Roman walls, old gates, church towers, French legal memory, and Prussian administration all remained there together, layered in the daily life of a Rhineland city that had known more than one master. Karl Marx was born there on the 5th of May, 1818, into a household that already understood how public authority could reach into private rooms. His father, Heinrich Marx, was a lawyer, educated, liberal in temperament, and trained in a legal culture shaped by the years when the Rhineland had belonged to Napoleonic France. His mother, Henriette Pressburg, came from a Dutch Jewish family, and the family history around the child was older, more complicated, and more exposed to law than a simple provincial childhood might suggest. Heinrich Marx had been born Herschel Levi Mordecai into a line of rabbis, yet his adult life required a different public identity. Prussian rule brought restrictions on Jews holding certain professional positions, and the legal profession that sustained his household pressed him toward conversion. He entered the Lutheran Church in the 1820s, and his children were baptized as well. The act can be mistaken, from a distance, for a purely inward religious decision, but in Trier it also belonged to the practical world of licenses, offices, and respectable survival. A father who wanted to practice law, support his family, and move inside the educated class of a Christian state had to reckon with rules that did not remain outside the front door. This was one of the first quiet facts around Marx's childhood. The state was not an abstraction. It could decide who might plead a case, who might hold a post, who might be trusted, and which inherited name had to be softened or set aside. Heinrich did not raise his son as a religious rebel, and the Marx household was not a school of open defiance. It was, rather, a household of books, law, argument, and careful adaptation. The child who later wrote so relentlessly about the material pressures beneath ideas grew up in a family where identity itself had been shaped by the terms of professional life. That does not explain everything about him, but it gives the beginning of his story a useful weight. The Trier into which Karl grew was not a great capital, and that mattered. Berlin had the ministries and universities, Paris had the clubs and journals, London had the banks, docks, and factories. But Trier had the slower education of a borderland. The Rhineland had absorbed French civil law and certain habits of civic life during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period, then passed into the possession of conservative Prussia after 1815. People there could remember, in law and custom, a different political order from the one now governing them. Heinrich Marx admired enlightened thought and constitutional restraint, and his liberalism had the form of a man who respected law but disliked arbitrary power. His son would inherit something of that tension, though he would carry it much further than his father wished. Inside the Marx home, the atmosphere was not one of poverty. Heinrich's profession gave the family stability, books, schooling, and social ambition, even if the household was not wealthy in the grander sense. Karl was one of several children, and the ordinary facts of family life surrounded him. Lessons, illnesses, visits, expectations, and the steady authority of a father who believed education could lift a child into public usefulness. Henriette's presence was quieter in the historical record, partly because the papers that preserve 19th century men's careers often leave women at the edge of the page. She remained more attached to household matters, to family anxieties, and to the practical continuity of domestic life. In later years, Marx's relationship with her would become strained over money and inheritance, but in childhood she belonged to the sheltering structure from which he first moved outward. School gave Karl Marx the formal shape of a young, educated Rhinelander. At the Trier Gymnasium, he received the classical training expected of boys who might enter the professions. Latin composition, Greek authors, history, religion, and rhetoric filled the routine, and the discipline of such schooling mattered even for a mind that later turned against many inherited authorities. A young man trained in the classics learned not only language, but hierarchy, argument, quotation, and the habit of moving between old texts and present concerns. Marx's later writing, however difficult and modern in subject, retained something of this older education. It carried long sentences, historical reach, literary allusion, and a taste for turning an opponent's own language back upon him. The school itself was not politically innocent. In the 1830s, Prussian authorities watched education carefully, especially in regions where liberal feeling and Catholic identity made officials uneasy. The Trier Gymnasium had teachers whose sympathies were not always perfectly aligned with the state's expectations. Wittenbach, the headmaster, had a reputation for liberal views, and such a setting gave Marx a version of intellectual seriousness that was not identical with obedience. His student essays already showed moral ambition, though not yet the hard economic direction of the adult work. One early graduation essay considered the choice of a profession and treated human fulfillment as bound to service beyond the self. The tone was youthful, but the impulse to connect an individual life with a larger human purpose had already appeared. Ludwig von Westphalen gave Marx another kind of education. A cultivated Prussian official from an aristocratic family, Westphalen lived near the Marx household and became a close influence on the young Karl. He knew literature, history, and politics, and he shared books and conversation with a boy whose appetite for reading was already large. Through Westphalen, Marx encountered not only German literature but also Shakespeare, Romantic writing, and broader European thought. The relationship complicates the later image of Marx as merely a child of class resentment. One of the figures who widened his mind belonged to the educated aristocratic world, and Marx's intellectual formation passed through admiration as well as opposition. Jenny von Westphalen, Ludwig's daughter, belonged to this same neighboring world. She was older than Karl, socially above him, admired for intelligence and beauty, and connected to a family with rank. Their attachment began early and quietly became one of the fixed emotional facts of Marx's life. The engagement, when it came, crossed expectations of class and social prudence, and it required patience because Marx had no settled career and few immediate prospects. Jenny did not enter his life as a later ornament to fame. She belonged to the beginning, to the Trier years, to the time before exile, poverty, and manuscripts consumed the household they would eventually build together. A young Marx, then, was formed among contrasts rather than certainties. His father represented law, liberal moderation, and professional adaptation. Westphalen represented cultivation, aristocratic ease, and literary breadth. Trier represented a provincial city carrying Roman stone, Catholic memory, French legal habits, and Prussian suspicion. Jenny represented affection joined to social risk. These were not yet theories. They were the materials from which a mind could learn that society was never a single smooth surface. Behind manners lay rank, behind religion lay permission, behind law lay power, and behind a family's comfort lay conditions that had once required a change of name and church. Heinrich Marx watched his son's gifts with pride and unease. Karl was intelligent, intense, and already inclined toward large feeling. He wrote poetry, thought about literature, and did not seem likely to become the calm, orderly professional his father might have preferred. The letters Heinrich later sent to him at university show a father trying to guide a brilliant but unsettling son toward discipline. They also show affection strained by worry. For Heinrich, education was a path into stability. For Karl, it would become a path into criticism. Many families have known that difference in smaller forms. When a parent offers schooling as a ladder and the child uses it as a vantage point from which to question the building itself. The wider world beyond Trier was also changing in ways not yet visible from the schoolroom. The industrial transformation that Marx would later study had already altered Britain and was beginning to press upon the continent. Railways, coal, mechanized production, expanding cities, and new forms of wage labor were becoming the architecture of the age. In the Rhineland, commercial and industrial growth gave liberal citizens reasons to resent old restrictions and bureaucratic control. Marx did not grow up inside a factory town like Manchester, but he grew up near enough to economic change, legal conflict, and political frustration to understand that modern life was being rearranged. The deepest shocks of that rearrangement would reach him later. At 17, Marx left Trier for the University of Bonn. The departure did not yet look like the beginning of exile, though the pattern of leaving had begun. He carried with him his father's hopes, his mother's concern, Jenny's attachment, Westphalen's literary influence, and the disciplined residue of a classical education. The law was supposed to provide the respectable frame for his future, and Bonn seemed to offer the first step toward that expected career. Yet the young man who arrived there was not made for simple obedience to a course catalogue. He was entering university with enough talent to impress, enough pride to resist guidance, and enough inward restlessness to make education dangerous to every plan designed to contain him. Bonn would loosen him before Berlin sharpened him. The student world there gave him wine, debts, poetry, quarrels, and a first taste of freedom away from Trier's watchful households. Heinrich's careful hopes would soon meet the unruly habits of a son who was not yet the severe critic of capitalism, not yet the exile of London, not yet the author of Capital, but already difficult to settle. The road from Trier had begun as a family's investment in a profession. It continued, almost at once, into the disorderly education of a mind that would not remain within the law. Chapter 2. Bonn, Berlin, and the argument with philosophy. The University of Bonn received Karl Marx in 1835 as a place of study, but also as a place where a young man away from home could discover how quickly freedom became disorder. He had come to read law, the subject that promised a respectable road toward office, advocacy, and the kind of professional life Heinrich Marx understood. Bonn, however, was not only lecture halls and examinations. It had student societies, taverns, debts, quarrels, and the theatrical habits of young men who believed that adulthood could be postponed for a while beneath the name of university life. Marx entered this world with ability, ambition, and very little talent for moderation. His first months at Bonn did not reassure his father. Marx joined a drinking society, wrote poetry, spent money too freely, and became entangled in student conduct that sat uneasily beside the sober legal career imagined for him. There was even a brief imprisonment for disorderly behavior, one of those minor academic punishments that might have seemed almost ordinary among students, but not to a father already worried about his son's direction. Heinrich's letters from Trier carried affection, irritation, and a lawyer's anxiety over wasted promise. The son was gifted enough to justify high hopes, but gifts could become dangerous if they were not given shape. Bonn also gave Marx his first experience of intellectual life without immediate discipline. He attended lectures in law, but his attention moved toward literature, poetry,